Welcome to this China Carbon Forum hosted discussion where we are focusing on China's recent climate change and environmental developments. My name is Peter Edwards. I'm the General Manager of China Carbon Forum. Very pleased today to be joined with two experts from organisations which work at the intersection of environment and economy. Miss Elle Carberry, a Managing Director of the Paulson Institute Beijing Office, and Mr. Calvin Quek, Head of Sustainable Finance at Greenpeace East Asia. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to give a bit of context, recently China has announced its climate action plan, submitting its INDC to the UN. Coupled with, on the ground in Beijing, here in particular, we're seeing much more blue skies over recent months. So Calvin, perhaps turning to yourself, I know that Greenpeace has collaborated with the Paulson Institute on a commentary entitled Beijing Blue Skies, Is This the New Normal? So Calvin, is this the new normal?
Well, thanks, Peter. That is a really tricky question to answer. When Beijing is here, I count myself as one of them. We used to always wish for wind to blow from the north because the winds that would come from the south, sort of the more industrialized area of the surrounding province, Hebei, would actually bring with it a lot of the industrial effluents, polluting gases that would make our skies gray. And the wind that would blow from the north, that would come from Russia down south, would actually tend to clear that out. In the piece that we had collaborated with the Paulson Institute, while it wasn't a scientific study, we found that this year's weather conditions, the way in which the wind blew, did not play a very, very active role in terms of reducing or keeping air pollution levels lower this year compared to years previously. We found that this year's air pollution levels are significantly lower compared to 2013 and 2014. And some of that might have to do with the fact that Beijing is in the process right now of implementing its national air pollution plan, which it announced in 2013. So to your question about whether Beijing's blue skies are going to continue, really it comes down to whether there will be continued success in terms of implementing many of the key recommendations in that air pollution plan.
Thank you. Ms. Carberry, perhaps turning to yourself now, you've got a long-standing set of experiences here in China focused on the clean tech industry. When claims are made that China will need to sacrifice its GDP growth to ensure blue skies across China, what is your response?
Yeah, our response is that economic and environmental prosperity go hand in hand. And the good news now is that many years after environmental laws were implemented in other nations and enforced, we can see the 30, 40 years of experience from places like LA and Pittsburgh, where they were quite strong on enforcing the law, rebalancing their industrial mix, and now those cities are growth engines across a diversified set of industries. Many of them are cleaner, greener, manufacturing, services, other kind of industries. So those are sort of wonderful proof points that you can achieve both, and frankly, for both of those cities, their kind of impetus to change was caused because of environmental problems and pollution, and from some of the same industries that are causing the pollution here in China. So we're trying to bring forward that expertise and insights to China so that China can build upon those, apply what's relevant, and build the China model of how to kind of make some of those choices and decisions. In particular, then we work closely with the national government as well as with regional government, but we see and very, very give credit to the Chinese government around really prioritizing the environment as a top part of its national strategy. That's extremely important. And within that then was also the looking at the problems from a regional basis. So there are three big regions in the country that are under focus, and in particular up here in the north is the region of Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, or Jing-Jin-Ji. And this region is already under the new environmental laws and strong enforcement that the other regions will sort of receive by the time of the 13th five-year plan next March. So this region is now a place where we're doing our active work to really see if we can take the best of other experiences, understand the local experience, and try to find the potential solutions. And Jing-Jin-Ji is a heavy industry area, but it also has plenty of emerging examples of new industries that are being created, be it renewable, be it green building, be it the services industries that accompany those. So we're trying to help also bring more awareness to these new industries that are growing up, as well as thinking about how do you help control the emissions from the heavy industry, and very supportive of the government's also overall reform agenda, which is trying to kind of focus on domestic demand and sort of reduce the sort of investment-led culture, which led to overcapacity of many heavy industries. So those range of environmental and economic policies is the place where we're working closely to try to help. It's the mix of those things working together, and that's why we also believe that the two things can occur together, economic and environmental prosperity, and there are proof points that show that that is a path forward, and we're trying to help make that possible now in China.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, Peter, I'll just say that prior to the air pollution issue becoming a big issue in China, China was actually growing at almost 8% a year, and the previous premier, Mr. Wen Jiabao, he actually said himself that Beijing's economy was unstructured, uncoordinated, unbalanced, and that 8% was actually hiding a lot of structural issues in the economy. So the theory or the claim that dealing with air pollution is not in sync with economic growth is a very simplistic, obviously simplistic assumption. The reality is that if you don't have clean air, you have actually a lot of other problems that will come and bite your economy over the long term. And the Chinese economy is also, because it's overly dependent on investment-led growth, it's also practically inefficient in terms of resources. So I think when it comes to the air pollution issue, which just galvanized the country, in some sense, when that happened, it was the tip of an iceberg, a whole number of issues related to China's economy that the Chinese officials wanted to deal with, but never had sort of the popular mandate to deal with. And once that air pollution issue exploded in 2013, we just saw such a huge momentum, political momentum to deal with this issue. And that, in some sense, is the backbone for many of the things that Xi Jinping is saying he wants to do with respect to the economy. So we're seeing now China is actually committing to reducing heavy industry in many areas, reforming various sectors, and increasingly so dealing with carbon emissions, which then connects us to its commitments that it announced just recently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. You both come from very well-respected organizations. Perhaps I could ask you a bit about those organizations, but in particular the recommendations that you might have for China given the recent developments. Perhaps Calvin, you could start.
Thanks, Peter. Well, this economic transformation, dealing with the air pollution issue that China is embarking on, will not be easy. Hebei is home to the world's largest steel sector. It employs hundreds and thousands of people in this sector. There are many entrenched interests that are against China moving away from this investment-led culture that Elle mentioned. There is a lot of built-up kind of sectors, secondary sectors that have relied on the heavy industry sector to survive, and that will have to be reformed if the fundamental pin which held that economy together is going to be rethought over again. So I think with respect to Chinese officials, what they're going to have to deal with and what they would need to understand is that they will require a lot of fortitude and internal courage to push these policies ahead. For example, putting a price on carbon, putting a more efficient pricing on, say, coal resources, dealing with electricity prices. That whole reform agenda is not going to be as easy as we would like it to be. And that's going to take a lot of political courage by Xi Jinping and his colleagues. And I think this is an area where the NGO sector, my organization, can actually help, because as a third party, we'll be able to provide, in some sense, independent sources of information. China today has some of the best air pollution information throughout the entire country, which actually helps the government monitor the situation across the country. It is a very large country with many areas which perhaps some areas where they don't have the eyes on the ground. And I think the role of the NGOs and for greater transparency will help China towards eventual success in implementing its long-term economic goals.
Thank you. Elle, perhaps Paulson Institute and your recommendations for China.
Yeah. So just to mention a word about our focus, and that is that we focus on the U.S.-China bilateral relationship from the belief that the two largest economies and the two largest emitters in the world need to sort of lead from the front, and so we're trying to enable that, but in particular by looking at how does one, let's say, invest in the environment as a common agenda between the nations, and then through that create sustainable economic growth for both nations. So we think of investment in the environment as the common agenda and the way to grow, okay? So then within that, we've been doing work on, now that there is a very strong environmental law going into place, as I said, kind of in phases, starting up here in the north, and along with that, the enforcement, where are the next places where policies can have the biggest impact? And so we think policies that incentivize markets to come along and follow the government's leadership creates a further, quite a big shift in these directions, and in ways that are low to no cost to the government. Mm-hmm. You know, simple change in policy, lots of other market actors get involved and use their own money, use their own people, pay for their training and development, develop the IP, right? So, so the 4 areas where we've been doing our recent work, where we think could make the most difference, and we picked them to be somewhat kind of from everything from energy generation to energy use, and then broad market mechanisms. So on the energy generation side, we were looking at small changes in the power sector that would enable more use of renewables. You know, just as small changes in those areas that would save millions of dollars in terms of investment in new coal thermal plants, as well as, you know, tons and tons of savings in the emissions. In another area, we're looking at how does industry relate to the grid in terms of how much demand does it have at what times of the day, and kind of integrating that when renewables are being used, and another way to save coal thermal power and emissions. A third area we're looking at is in the building sector, which uses 40% of energy. So there are emerging examples internationally and also here in China around if a building publicly discloses its energy use, what does that do to attract tenants who care about a kind of more efficient energy use and lower utility bill in the future, as well as then stimulate the market for the suppliers that provision those solutions for the green buildings. And then the fourth area is a broad market mechanism, what Calvin also just mentioned around carbon emissions trading. So, you know, China has been very, very leading, not only in these other areas, but in this carbon emissions trading, where the 7 regional pilots are now being fashioned and coordinated into a national system. These are all places where the nation is working hard and aggressively. As an international organization, we're just trying to bring along further international expertise to, let's say, help think about more of the how-to and the implementation questions, so that, you know, China's implementation can get it, you know, as well as possible. So those are places where we think markets can make a difference, and we think now is the time, thanks to the air pollution laws, because of the year 2013, and now it really does support what you're talking about, Calvin, that, you know, the air pollution issue here really kind of, you know, catalyzed in January 2013, has led to a whole downstream of action that's about environment and emissions, but is very much about economic transformation. And you see how well these things go together, and we're trying to enable that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your insights and your recommendations. I'm sure you'll agree it's a very interesting time to be involved in the climate change and environment space in China here. We hope that we can keep this dialogue open. I'm sure you'll agree. We'll invite comments and questions from other experts, and hope to have another discussion soon. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Peter.